All right, welcome everybody, and I hope you're all having a great afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Tipping Point, Connecticut's first affordable housing conference series. My name is Charlie Shaddix. I'm the communications manager at the Partnership for Strong Communities. Throughout the week, we are hosting over 30 sessions featuring local, state, and national experts leading conversations that explore challenges, share best practices, and coalesce us around critical next steps to address key affordable housing issues in our state. This session is about accessory dwelling units and housing conversions, which I think is a topic that all Connecticut residents should be interested in. Everybody knows that Connecticut prides itself on being the land of steady habits. We love what we already have in this state, and often for good reason. So today we're going to be talking about building more housing using the housing we already have. It's a tremendous and intuitive idea, and one that's already successfully been used in many Connecticut towns. Earlier this year, the Regional Plan Association released a report called Be My Neighbor, which explored the potential for accessory dwelling units and conversions to create more diverse housing options in the tri-state region. This session is going to discuss some of the findings and recommendations from that report, and we'll be hearing from representatives from RPA and some other tri-state organizations. Before we turn it over to our presenters, I just want to take a moment to thank the leading sponsors for this event, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority and the Melville Charitable Trust. Their deep support has allowed this conference series to exist. I also want to thank our collaborating sponsor, the Connecticut Department of Housing, and our supporting sponsors, Housing Enterprises Incorporated and Whittlesey. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. The session is being recorded. We'll make all recordings available to conference attendees as soon as possible. All participants have entered muted. Please remain on mute unless the presenter has asked you to unmute. If you have a technology issue, please select the chat icon in the Zoom control panel and send it in the chat to myself or to Sean Gio. We will do our best to assist you. Your presenters will let you know how they would like content questions to be submitted. In a few minutes before the end of the session, we will launch a poll that asks for your feedback on the session. Please take a minute to share and help us improve future webinars and conference offerings. Lastly, the Partnership for Strong Communities is undergoing a strategic planning process for our Home Connecticut campaign for housing opportunity in Connecticut. We're working to better understand the needs of our communities and affordable housing partners. So towards the end of the session, we'll be sharing a link to a survey in the chat. Please just take 5 minutes after the session to share your feedback. We timed it out. It only takes 5 minutes and shape the issues we work on and the ways we work. I'll now turn it over to our presenters to get us started.
Hello, and welcome to our Untapped Housing Solutions panel and session. My name is Marcel Negret. I'm a senior planner at the Regional Plan Association. I'm joined by my colleague, Melissa Kaplan-Macey, Vice President for State Programs and our Director for Connecticut. We're also joined by Maya Stacks. She is a councilwoman for Princeton, New Jersey, and a member of the Planning Board. We're also joined by Danielle Dobin. She is the chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission for the town of Westport, Connecticut, and Alec Schierenbeck, who is an attorney and the housing advocate for New York State. Before we dive into the discussion component of our session, I wanted to give a quick overview of the Regional Plan Association and some of the work that we've done associated with accessory dwelling units. We're a small group of people, but we're very hardworking and talented. And I think, as I've heard Melissa say in previous sessions, we punch above our weight. I'm happy to have them as colleagues. We do planning work in the tri-state area, and it implies this covers the southwestern portion of Connecticut, the lower Hudson Valley, Long Island, New York City's 5 boroughs, and northern New Jersey. The RPA has been for almost 100 years doing this type of work. In every generation or so, we release a regional plan, the most recent one being released in 2017 and the 4th regional plan. This revolved around 4 main values: equity, health, prosperity, and sustainability. One of the main findings or recommendations had to do with making the region affordable for everyone, and acknowledging that many households are cost burdened, that the prosperity shared in our region is not equally distributed. And one of those recommendations had to do with, as Charlie articulated, with the idea of creating new housing units or new homes with the existing housing stock that we have or without new major construction. But before I dive into that, some additional context. This chart is showing the percent change of home values over the past decade. And as you could see in many, and showing the change as a percentage for each county within our region. There are 31 counties. And you can see that in some cases, this increase is in the double digits. In some cases, even more than 50% of the increase. So our housing is getting more expensive. And this has to do with an undersupply of new housing production. And as this map shows, and over the same time period since 2010, over 80% of the housing units that have been permitted are concentrated in the 5 boroughs or northern New Jersey. The rest of the region is not doing its fair share in contributing to our housing needs. And this is not a coincidence. It has to do with exclusionary zoning and the legacy of segregation. Now this meme, which I won't take credit for, this was shared by Sean Galbraith, an urban planner in Toronto, which served as inspiration for the title of our report, Be My Neighbor. And if we look back at the history of housing segregation, redlining the pre and post World War II housing policies that not only promoted single family housing creation, but also exclusionary zoning. And if we look at the land use patterns throughout the region, and mostly focusing on those areas that are better served by transit, RPA is a huge proponent and advocate for transit-oriented development and maintaining our transit infrastructure in shape and expanding on it. We looked at there's an underutilization of some of these geographies. If we zoom into different parts of our region, here's a zoom of Morris County in New Jersey. Here's another one in Connecticut. We see a pattern of a lot of most of the housing stock in these areas being in the form of single family detached housing. Collectively, throughout the tri-state area, there are about 300,000 McMansions covering 170,000 acres of land in these areas that are well served by transit. To give you a sense of how much 170,000 acres is, you could fit Central Park 200 times and over. So it's a huge underutilization of our land. It's underutilizing the investments, the historical investments that we've made in our transit infrastructure. And it's stifling our economic growth. But it's also contributing, stagnating segregation. We analyzed the housing stock of all the 782 municipalities in the tri-state area, and then compare that with the racial and ethnic profile of each of these municipalities that have control over the land use and zoning. And you see the chart that there is a consistent correlation when there is a higher share of single family detached houses. There's more segregation by race, but also by income, which is a very similar graphic to this one. So what do we do with drivable suburbia, which is not good for the environment and exacerbating segregation? Well, we have many ideas. You should read the 4th regional plan to see all of them, but one of them is ADUs and conversions. So accessory dwelling units come in many shapes and forms. Here are some typologies: detached, above garage, interior low level, or basement conversion, a conversion of your cellar space, or even your garage. The main idea is that even though it's an accessory unit to the primary, it's independent in the sense that it has all the amenities to facilitate a standalone unit, kitchen and bathroom. But we also talk about conversions, and without expanding the footprints or the density of the existing housing stock, you could convert these to allow for duplexes, triplexes, or even fourplexes. Here are some references within our own region. I think these are mostly in Westchester. A detached unit of a conversion of a garage, of an extension, and a conversion in Queens. We also took reference and inspiration for a lot of what's been happening in the West Coast, primarily in Oregon and Portland. We also dived into some of the zoning ordinances within our region to see how the policy intent that is supposed to create or allow for ADUs is really hampered when you look at the details and the nitty-gritty of dimensional requirements, parking requirements, occupancy requirements, which effectively impede the creation of ADUs and conversions. And so we estimated and connected with the projections that were made for the fourth plan and the aspirational growth vision for that. We estimated that there's a huge potential for creating many units, hundreds of thousands effectively, and in areas that have high access to jobs through transit. We have 4 major recommendations. The first one is providing a base or a floor to ensure that there's consistent language and regulations at the local level, which could be achieved through state legislation. Localities should also do their share in updating and amending zoning code to enable ADUs and conversions. And this has to do with some of the things that I mentioned, dimensional criteria, occupancy requirements, but also parking requirements. Parking requirements can either break or make ADUs. And finally, and I think this is related to the first recommendation, providing technical assistance, financing, and information to facilitate the creation of ADUs and conversions, mainly focusing on senior residents, but also in low and moderate homeowners. That was a quick overview and a lot of information, but I just wanted to keep it concise and short so that we could have a robust conversation and discussion, which I'm very excited to hear. If you want to read more details, please go to this website, www.rpa.org/work/reports/be-my-neighbor. With that, I'll introduce Melissa and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel. Thank you to everybody for joining us today for this conversation. I'd like to ask our panelists before we get into the moderated discussion, just to spend a couple of minutes explaining how they come into this conversation, sort of where they're at, why they're part of the panel today. I'm really excited as part of this Connecticut conference to have a regional conversation about accessory dwelling units. So as Marcel said at the beginning, we have folks from Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey on our panel today. So why don't we start at home in Connecticut? And Danielle, can you just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about why you're excited about ADUs and what you've been doing in Westport?
Sure. Thanks so much, Melissa, for the introduction. So my name is Danielle Dobin. I'm the elected chair of Westport's Planning and Zoning Commission. I also founded and I chair our Affordable Housing Subcommittee. So in Westport, we've been struggling with how to create a diversity of housing types in Westport to attract a diversity of people to live in Westport, but to do so in a way that fits with the architectural aesthetics of the town, which is predominantly single-family homes. So in the past 3 years, the Planning and Zoning Commission has approved, and there have been built about 10 different mixed income multifamily apartment buildings, all of which are 20% affordable, ranging in size, 28 units, 32 units, et cetera. But the missing ingredient is really being able to leverage the large lots that we have in a lot of neighborhoods where there are no sewers to add to our total of affordable housing or more accessibly priced middle housing that we can offer. I was really excited when I saw RPA's report. I think that ADUs are a fantastic job. And at our Affordable Housing Subcommittee, we have been exploring changing our regulations to permit them. And I'm excited to have a conversation about it later on. I think that they are a terrific method for towns to retain their sense of feel and sense of place, but to add a lot of accessibly priced housing in a way that works for the town.
Thank you, Danielle. And let's go to New Jersey. Mia, if you could just introduce yourself and how you come to this conversation.
Sure. Hi, I'm Mia Sachs. I'm a councilwoman in Princeton, and I also serve on the planning board and on the council's affordable housing negotiating team and subcommittee. And in the past year, Princeton has been involved, well, it's actually been 5 years in the making, but particularly in the last year, we've been in the final stages of settling our affordable housing compliance settlement with the state. And so I have am excited that we're going to be, over the next 3 years, I think, adding about I'd say about 1,000 more units of subsidized affordable housing in Princeton, but they are almost all of them rentals, and of course they are subsidized. And to Danielle's point, I think we've seen the bifurcation in Princeton of housing that is available for the very wealthy and housing that's available for people who qualify for subsidized housing, and that we're looking at the gradual, I would say, extinction would not be too strong a word, of the middle class in Princeton. And we have a local activist group called the Princeton Progressive Action Group that's has been advocating for more progressive land use policies. And even before I got on council, they were pushing for passage of an ADU ordinance. And we actually have in Princeton, we had 2 ordinances. We were 2 towns, a borough and a township, and we had 2 ordinances that were one was called a secondary dwelling unit and the other was called a flat ordinance. So they were the beginnings of an ADU ordinance framework, but we consolidated those ordinances in the past 6 months. We used the AARP ordinance as a model. And so the first ordinance that we passed actually eliminated homeowner occupancy and as well as some of the parking requirements. And then we went further a few months later and we passed a second ordinance, which amended the first ordinance, which allows for the second unit to actually be sold separately. We didn't know at the time that it was quite as radical as as it apparently is, but I understand that this is allowed in Portland and maybe other parts of the country. But we wanted to make sure that there were also home ownership opportunities for people at the middle and lower ends of the spectrum so that they could build equity. But anyway, I'm probably going into too much detail for an intro, but I'm really excited about what we've done in Princeton in the past year and very happy to share with other towns how we got there.
Thank you, Mia. And Alec, now coming to us sort of from more of a statewide view from New York State, if you could just give us a little background on how you come to this conversation.
Sure. Well, I'm an attorney. I specialize in appellate law, but I am agitating with a number of people for New York to try to move on ADUs. We see ADUs as an opportunity to address a production problem that Marcel was talking about. New York has a robust conversation on many vectors of the housing debate, but not so much on production. So, in 2019, there was landmark rent stabilization reform to protect tenants. There's a discussion right now around fair housing enforcement that has ensued after a kind of groundbreaking investigation by Newsday around discrimination in real estate practices on Long Island. But if you cast around at the local and state level to see whether there are frameworks for really increasing the supply of naturally occurring affordable housing, whatever term you'd like to use, you'll not find much. So we see ADUs as a way to thread a political needle for those folks that are anxious about changing the context of communities and always suspicious of big developers getting involved, but understand that we need to do something to address lack of affordable housing. ADUs seem to hit a sweet spot, or at least that's the theory. So happy to talk more about it with you all.
Great, thank you, Alec. So we will be talking about 30 minutes or so amongst myself with the panelists. But I do encourage the audience members to please, enter your questions into the chat as you think about them, and then we will organize and ask them towards the end. We'll also, in addition to partnerships poll for the conference, we'll also be sending out a polling question as well on this particular topic as we transition between the moderated discussion portion and the audience Q&A. So let's get started. First question. So Marcel talked about some of the obstacles to ADU creation, things like lot size and yard requirements, occupancy, parking. and things of that nature. I'm curious, probably first to Danielle and Mia on the ground, what you think sort of are the biggest obstacles, the hardest to overcome in terms of getting communities thinking about what legislation could look like and how that legislation could actually enable the creation. Because I think another thing Marcel mentioned was you can have ADU legislation, but it may not be effective. There may be obstacles even within the legislation that makes it hard to create actual units. So I don't know, Mia or Danielle or Alec too, if you have thoughts on the ground.
I'm happy to start, Melissa.
Okay.
Thanks. So, so from my perspective in Westport, this arose out of the Affordable Housing Subcommittee based on some of the information from RPA's report. So something that we're particularly concerned about is ensuring that these are actually naturally occurring affordable housing. And one of the issues we have, I just got muted by the host, it said, but.
Sorry, I was trying to admit somebody, but she had already been admitted. So
okay,
sorry.
No problem. I'll start again. So what I would say is I think one of our biggest considerations is ensuring that the ADUs that result are actually affordable and accessibly priced. So in Westport, which for those who are not familiar, is a coastal town in Fairfield County. It's an affluent town with very high land values. What we are concerned about is not limiting who can live in any of the ADUs. From the get-go, our intent has been to not limit these to seniors, not limit these to people who are related by blood to somebody who lives in a house, et cetera, but to make them freely rentable. First and foremost, one of our main considerations is ensuring that they are not rented as expensive short-term rentals and become a part of the stream of Airbnbs. In Westport, it's very possible for people to look at creating an ADU if they were legally permitted to do so. Right now, generally they are not. And then to rent that ADU for $1,000 or $2,000 for a night, a single night at the height of the summer if it's located in certain neighborhoods. And obviously that does nothing to move forward accessibly priced housing. So first and foremost, we're looking at limiting short-term rentals of any ADUs that are created. Secondly, we're looking at the size of the ADU. There's been some talk on a state level of enabling legislation that would mandate that towns adopt their own regulations, permitting ADUs of up to 1,200 square feet. So the issue with 1,200 square feet is that a 1,200 square foot dwelling unit in many neighborhoods in Westport that's brand new, again, will not be accessibly priced. It would rent for the month for something like $4,000 a month, or $4,500 or even $5,000 a month, depending on the neighborhood. And again, if our intent is to create something that's accessibly priced, we want to be conscientious about size. So what our subcommittee is doing in Westport is looking at taking 2 tracks based on the size of a lot. Almost every single family home in Westport, if they have coverage available, would have a kind of bonus of 300 square feet of FAR to add on, and would be able to create an ADU, a detached ADU with no restrictions other than no short-term rentals of about 650 square feet. And it would be permitted to be 1.5 stories tall, so that there could be a loft or a smaller bedroom. And then in larger lots, we would go up to probably 1,200 square feet. And the reason we would do that is because as opposed to how many people think about places like Westport, our larger lots in Westport are actually generally less valuable than our smaller lots. The smaller lots are generally located closer to the beach, closer to town, and are often priced a little bit higher. The other thing we're looking at is parking that makes sense for a community where there's almost no public transportation whatsoever, but that's not onerous. So we're looking at simply allowing 1 off-street parking spot per ADU, and it can exist as part of a tandem spot in somebody's driveway. So I think it's possible to plan properly for parking and off-site parking without that parking requirement being particularly onerous. I would say that in the state of Connecticut, and I think most people are joining us in Connecticut, one of the biggest issues we're facing relates to 830G. As most people know, 830G is a state statute that allows developers to bypass local zoning regulations if they're creating developments that are 30% affordable on site if a municipality is not compliant with the statute. Westport, like many of the towns in Fairfield County and the rest of Connecticut, are not compliant with the statute. And one of the challenges we're facing with ADUs is that if our Planning and Zoning Commission permits ADUs, we will have many more potential units added to the denominator for how our pure number of housing units is calculated by the state. And that means that instead of helping us with regard to 830G and becoming compliant with 830G, that developing and permitting ADUs that are freely rented other than no short-term rentals could actually end up hurting us in terms of our appearance of compliance with 830G. So one way that I think that the state could be really helpful in this respect is to look at taking ADUs out of the equation for 830G entirely. So they won't count as more towards moratorium points unless they're deed restricted, but they also just won't count overall in terms of setting municipalities back. And I think that that step in and of itself would be really valuable in terms of encouraging towns like Westport that are concerned about non-compliance with 830G to kind of get on board the idea of allowing the ADUs. So I think I've said enough about it for now, about our perspective. I'll let a few other people have the chance.
Great, thank you. Well, I think I'll pivot it a little bit and throw it to Mia just to ask, so talking about some of the challenges, but you've had a lot of success, obviously, in Princeton. So in terms of structuring your ordinance so that it's workable and so that it's meaningful, what do you think what works best, or what is working best for you in Princeton?
Well, ask me again in a year, because we just passed the ordinance. So I think it's going to be an iterative process, but we wanted to pass it quickly because I would say the biggest obstacle is what we all know, and that's the NIMBY opposition. And before that, gathered storm, we felt like there was a moment in which we had the political will to pass it. And so we wanted to go ahead and pass it. And I think we may continue to make other amendments. But I mean, I would say that our approach right now was to literally take a page out of the RPA's recommendations and is an update our zoning and parking ordinances, the relevant ordinances to eliminate any and all possible obstacles to ADU creation. And I know that could lead to unintended consequences on the other side. Just in terms of the numbers of what we did, how it is now is it's maximum 800 square feet, or for example, for the larger lots, 25% of the total space of the structure. So if there was bonus FAR anyway, then there would still be bonus FAR. The only way you would get bonus FAR in the creation of an ADU is if you make it disabled compliant. If you added if it was ADA compliant. So that and in terms of parking, there were already parking regulations. I mean, we are coming from a somewhat different standpoint in that we did have 2 ADU ordinances that allowed rentals, and they had very strict parking requirements. We eliminated those. So now, if you already have an ADU or you're creating a new one, you would only need to add parking if you have more than 2 bedrooms. Or what we call, residential units. So it's like a bedroom or a living room. And the likelihood of that, I think, is not high in that sort of square footage. But I guess we figured if it was a huge house and they took 25 square feet of that and they added parking, that would not be the end of the world. That was sort of our, approach to that. But it's interesting because, Danielle, you mentioned the concern about making sure that the units remain affordable and don't just become an income generating stream for people who are not interested in contributing to the overall share of affordable housing in the town. And that was definitely a concern for us. But I will say that, the farther you dig into this, it gets more and more complicated because we actually have a large number of older residents in our town who are already using their existing ADUs as Airbnbs, and that's the only way that they're able to age in place and pay the taxes to remain in Princeton. So, and I guess my feeling right now, and again, ask me in a year, but about regulations is that you can try to regulate, but at the same time that our town spent 2 years, the zoning board fighting a bed and breakfast, and eventually voted it down, was the same 2 years that Airbnb was becoming rampant in Princeton. And so I guess my feeling about regulations now is we just have to, we tried to focus on what we did want to achieve. And for sure, there are going to be people who abuse the privilege, and there will be things that happen on the margins and unintended consequences. But our approach was really, as I said, taken right out of RPA's recommendation, which was to focus on eliminating any and all ordinances, regulations, whatever that would prevent the creation of ADUs. And our feeling was that on benefit, that was going to be for the greater good than the restrictions. So, yeah.
We're obviously very happy. I'm sure I can speak for myself and Marcel that our report has been useful on the ground in Princeton.
Very much so, yeah.
So I'll pick up on the thread of what you said on the senior housing, Mia, and throw this one to Alec. You had mentioned about ARP has been a vocal supporter of ADUs and as a way to help seniors age in place, provide additional income. So Alec, can you talk about your experience with ADUs as they relate to senior housing when you're thinking kind of statewide and what the state of New York might do, sort of what conditions or regulations are needed to address senior housing needs?
Well, I mean, I think it's one of the most appealing selling points for ADUs is how they fit into changing housing needs, changing demographic needs. And you need to design a ADU ordinance so that it doesn't preclude the uses that seniors are asking for. That means that it has to be a place, you want to maintain flexibility so that young family, when they're in town, could be there potentially. You want to maintain flexibility so that home health aide might be able to use that as a primary residence. You also want to make sure that if the tenant of an ADU is going to be a senior, that there are provisions, appropriate protections for a tenant who's a senior, and accommodations can be made. There are, often in housing accommodations laws, fair housing laws provide that a tenant can make certain changes to a residence, a housing accommodation, in order to make sure that it can serve a senior, bars in the bathtub, et cetera. And usually that cost is borne by the tenant, the senior tenant, which is fine. But you want to make sure that those rules also extend to the ADU, so that it would be an appropriate place for a senior tenant. Those are some of the things I have in mind. But I think flexibility, yes, is particularly important for seniors on both ends of the spectrum, both the renter and the owner.
Can I ask, so another related question to that, it occurs to me as we're talking, obviously, the senior population and communities, we often talk about those. There are a lot of times of folks that do come out to public meetings, either for or against different, types of changes to zoning. Have you, Mia or Danielle, and your experience seen, is this something that's rallying the seniors in your community as you're talking about these types of regulations? Are folks getting involved? Sort of what is the experience on the ground with respect to people embracing ADUs as a solution to seniors aging in place? And that's for either of you or both of you.
Mia, do you want to go first this time, and then I'll go since I've been speaking first? So I don't know that there was a groundswell of seniors because, as I said, first of all, we're in COVID, so the general civic flow of information is a bit, curtailed, or the normal people showing up at meetings and so on and so forth. So we're in a sort of an odd time. But I will say that
in terms of my own motivation as a council person, I was, this was a top priority for me, the ADU ordinance coming in, because my mother has lived her whole life in this town, and she's been able to remain here for, the last 20 years as a senior citizen because of an ADU that she has. And that's literally how she, is able to remain in a place like Princeton, where it's difficult unless you have a huge amount of disposable income to age in place. And it's not just my mother. There are a lot of, my friends' parents that who are desperately trying to stay here. And many of them are staying here through the same, in the same way with an ADU. So I wanted to make it just more possible for more seniors, because you could do it, but it was only if you were, had a certain configuration already in your house. It was very constrained. So I just want to make it more available for more people. But as I said, I think in terms of, there wasn't really enough time to even generate that sort of engagement. And yeah, so anyway.
Thank you. Danielle, do you have anything to add on that
Sure.
topic?
So here in Westport, we've actually long had an accessory apartment regulation that permitted an accessory apartment within the main dwelling unit for seniors to create, so that they could create that opportunity to either live there themselves and rent out the other space, or rent out the space. And it hasn't been tremendously popular. What we have heard from are people who just generally want to have flexibility with how to use their property. So there's a lot of people who want to be able to create a detached ADU because they'd like a guest house for their in-laws to live, or they'd like a place where their children can live and commute to New York City, but live less expensively at home with them. They've looked at creating an ADU because they only live in Westport for part of the year, and they'd love to have somebody on site on their property to keep an eye on things when they're not here, but not living within their house. So we've received a lot of interest from people across the board. And I would have to say at this point, we really haven't run into any sort of a NIMBY issue. We've been conducting our hearings online. We have 50 to 60 people join us, all, different residents of town. And I think that this is just an idea whose time has come. People are concerned about size. They're concerned about ensuring there's parking, but there is not a huge NIMBY backlash right now against it, nor is there one particular group that wants to see this happen. I would say across the board, it's just a modern way of looking at property utilization would be to have this opportunity in the future to use your house to have an ADU.
Great, thank you. So I think we'll pivot a little bit now to talk about sort of the roles of different levels of government, because we've talked about local government and the local government's taking the lead. Alex representing kind of more of the view from the states, but so state law can be more or less proactive to support ADU policy and programs. What do you all think can and should states be doing to promote ADUs? Are there ways to, I guess, encourage municipalities, or sort of the carrot and stick question, I guess. So
Sure.
I don't know, Alex,
I'll take the
Danielle,
first, only because
sure.
I'm on the ground trying to draft a regulation in the midst of what's going on in the state. So first and foremost, within the state of Connecticut, the most important step that the state could do is ensure that ADUs do not count against municipalities with regard to compliance with 830G. For many people involved in planning in towns that are not already compliant with 830G, the shadow of 830G looms really, really large. And people are attuned and concerned, deeply concerned about taking any steps that set themselves back in terms of compliance. So first and foremost, removing ADUs in and of themselves from counting in any way towards the denominator, if you will, towards the overall number of dwelling units that count towards 830G would make a tremendous difference. Secondly, I think that the state could look at, I think the state will err if the legislature oversteps and and opts on behalf of all municipalities to permit ADUs the way that it has been proposed in a piece of legislation that was floated a few months ago, 1,200 square feet and allowed within the setbacks. Number one is, as anybody knows, with regard to particularly larger lots, even half-acre lots, there's really no reason to permit people to build within the setback if you really don't need them to do so. So, I think being respectful of setbacks makes a really big difference. Secondly, I think if the goal is to create accessibly priced housing, then overstepping in terms of mandating certain size be permitted as of right when they're built is a really big mistake. And instead, you'll just end up with luxury guest houses that are totally inaccessibly priced when they're being rented out. So I think the state in Connecticut, of all states, has a tremendously important role to play because of 830G. But I think that with regard to the other details, a much better approach might be to require municipalities as part of the affordability plan required by 830J, which passed recently, to have all municipalities as a part of their affordability plan come up with their own regulation for freely rentable ADUs detached and within the home, but to ensure that those don't count against a municipality for 830G. So sorry, Mia, I know it's very Connecticut heavy, but we happen to have a certain, we have our own regulatory framework within which we operate. So I think making them a part of the 830J affordability plans would make a lot of sense, but leave it up to each individual town to find a way to draft the laws so it works within their boundaries and for their different lot sizes. In Westport, we have lots that are as small as, I think 1/5 of an acre, and then other people who've amassed a lot of land and live on 4 acres. And one size certainly doesn't fit all in terms of an ADU, even within the confines of Westport. So I don't really think that there's a way to draft a state law that fits for ADUs for all over the state of Connecticut.
Thanks, Danielle. And Alex, so I know you're thinking about this sort of in New York State in a statewide context. What do you think the role of the state should be in this conversation?
Yeah, I envision a robust role for the state, and maybe it's different from the Connecticut context. The reality in New York is that there is no 830G. There's no state law at all that requires localities to do anything with respect to affordable housing. New Jersey has Mount Laurel doctrine. New York has nada, zilch. Localities are left entirely on their own devices, and we see the effects of that. I mean, we have scattered ADU ordinances around the state. None of them are creating significant amounts of housing at all, let alone affordable housing. Some of them have been around since the early 1980s. The reality is that local communities impose a set of requirements that makes it impossible or too costly to create an ADU. And if we want to fix a housing production problem, a segregation problem, an affordability problem in New York, that's going to have to come at a different level of generality than the locality, the way we've been doing things. So what does that mean? Obviously, primary responsibility for designing a local ordinance is always going to stay at the locality because of variation in local conditions. But what you need to do is what states like California have done, set some ground rules for what those local ordinances have to do to weed out some of the typical impediments to creating an ADU. So as of right, that's a precondition. If it's discretionary review, I know what the answer is already to the permit application. You need to set minimum sizes and maximum sizes that don't allow localities to say, well, you can't exceed 200 square feet. Well, you're not going to be creating too many units that meet that. Parking requirements are a huge impediment. They, as Marcel mentioned, they make or break. And so, if I had my druthers, a ordinance or a state law would just exempt all ADUs from parking requirements. And they would go further to allow the conversion of already on-site required parking structures like garages without a need to replace with another covered structure. Maybe you could replace with a on-site or off-street uncovered structure. But those are some of the things. I would love New York to adopt a California style law. And we've seen an explosion in California in just a couple of years as a result of that robust regulatory framework in permit applications and in places like LA and in the Bay Area. So the demand is there. The only impediment are a network of local rules that are going nowhere unless we move to the state level.
Thanks, Alec. And so Mia, over to New Jersey, what do you think about this kind of relationship between state and local government with respect to ADU policy and legislation?
Well, I actually had a question about for Danielle, because it's interesting. I think we might be in a mirror opposite situation. But so your, I guess it's called A830. Is that it?
We are in an opposite situation. So 830G is a state law that requires all municipalities in Connecticut to have 10% of their overall housing units deemed affordable as it's defined by that statute, which means that they were built after 1990 and deed restricted for several decades. And if a community is not compliant with 830G, and the vast majority of communities in Connecticut are not, then developers can bypass local zoning laws to basically build whatever it is that they think that they can get away with building, as long as 30% of the units on site are deemed affordable. So the issue with it is that developers come in and want to build 6 or 7 story buildings that are within the setback. You know, we've had applications. We had an application for a 56 unit building that was located in the middle of a wetlands, et cetera. And the burden of denying the case really falls on the P&Z. So normal special permit and site plan approvals are irrelevant. So the issue with that is that if a municipality in Connecticut adds enough affordable housing to increase their housing by, I think it's 2% overall, then they can receive a 4-year moratorium against future applications. So Westport right now enjoys a moratorium where there are no applicants permitted to ask for this exemption for 830G. So the issue is, if we add ADUs, we make it harder to ever achieve overall compliance with the statute. But on top of that, it also means that there's sort of these different constellations of affordable housing laws out there. And my feeling is that the state of Connecticut should look at 830G. Then 830J is a new regulation that requires towns, and I think it's an excellent regulation that requires towns to create affordability plans. I think it's every 5 years, and we are working on ours right now. What makes sense to me is including allowing ADUs without a special permit, absolutely, with, you know, simply as of right, but as a part of our overall affordability plan. So I think in New Jersey, you don't have quite the same issue, because there's not this constant concern of playing catch up with the state law and adopting a regulation for ADUs and having it count against you in terms of how you're viewed as overall affordable.
Well, I mean, I think we have some, you know, with the Mount Laurel process, of course, you know, it went to the courts. And so we have been, you know, staving off builder's remedy. And so we have that same sort of dynamic. And we do have there's a percentage, but it's determined by the courts and so on and so forth. But it's interesting because we are working with our local nonprofit. We have a nonprofit that runs a lot of our affordable housing, and we are hoping that the state will make it possible for ADUs to count in the 4th round of the affordable housing process in New Jersey, because we actually feel like, from a sort of an integration for all the reasons that ADUs are good, we would like to move towards integrating housing throughout the fabric of the town, rather than playing catch up the way Princeton did this last time. And we were sort of, the music stopped and we had to, you know, build a bunch of very, very large, you know, 200 and 300 plus unit structures, which is not ideal for a town. It would have been preferable if Princeton could have, in this time, been sort of thinking strategically about how to create ADUs throughout the town, at least, you know, to diminish, you know, the overall impact of these large, you know, mega structures. So, yeah, so I mean, we were actually hoping that the state would allow the ADUs to to be credited towards our overall quota, but I guess it's just, the way the laws work. But in terms of, but basically I agree with you in terms of flexibility. I think that every town is so different and needs to have the leeway to come up with an ordinance that best fits the town. And there's just no one size fits all, but I can see that in California, the statewide ordinance did generate a lot of activity. So,
But Mia, I have a question for you about that, because so we lived in California. As anybody who's called my cell phone knows, I still have a California cell phone. And my husband and I rented a guest house in Brentwood, and it was not remotely accessibly priced. It was better priced than renting a single family home. But Alec, I was thinking about when you were speaking before, if the idea is to really create more accessibly priced options in high opportunity zones, high opportunity towns, let's say, for example, in New York, Scarsdale, how would allowing somebody in Scarsdale where many of the houses cost between $4 and $6 million, build a 1,200 square foot ADU that rents for $5,000 a month, how does that move you forward? Because one of the arguments that I have sometimes with people on this issue, and why actually, Mia, I don't think they should count as affordable for moratorium points, is my concern that they will be more accessibly priced, but that they won't be actually affordable. And that's why I don't think they should count towards moratorium points per se. I think they should just be left out of it. But I'm curious, Alec and Mia, I think you guys don't have enough of them to necessarily have measured, but in California, in Beverly Hills, in Brentwood, in Pacific Palisades, the ADUs that exist, they are not affordable. They are not accessibly priced. And I don't know what's served by allowing people to create those in neighborhoods that, without ensuring that in some way, they create this pathway for people to live there who otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity to do so.
So Danielle, it's interesting because what you're saying is when you, Melissa, to your question about what the opposition was, to the extent that there was opposition in Princeton, it was exactly, Danielle, what you were saying. We were advocating for creating ADUs to make more, not affordable housing, but housing that's affordable, more of that accessible. And so there was the argument, exactly what you're saying. How can you guarantee that it will be that? And I guess to the extent that there is a role for the state, it could be providing some legislative, mechanisms or legal mechanisms for us to allow the production of ADUs and put in place some safeguards.
But then why would anybody build them? See, we have that issue. People ask, why not deed restrict? Why not require them to be deed restricted? But my concern is if we require them to be deed restricted, then nobody will build them, because why would people burden their home? It's more difficult to sell, more difficult to refinance. That's why we struck on size. Permitting only a smaller size would result in something that will naturally rent for less money.
Well,
But
so if I could interject for a moment.
That's where we did as well. We did the 800 square feet, and yes, but I think, I'm sorry, Alex, but I just want to say, like, going forward, this is really what we're looking at, is how we can, and the next year we're going to see how it develops. And I think we're going to be looking for amending the ordinance to put in places things that will ensure. And I'm sorry, just one more thing the reason why we wanted it to be part of our affordable housing, the COA, what used to be called the COA process, is because if it were part of that, then they can't just count. They would have, there are very strict regulations for low income, low income. They would automatically have those price restrictions to keep them affordable with deed restrictions and so on and so forth. So that was what the appeal for us of them being counted for that, which sounds like it's a little different than how it works in Connecticut. So.
I was just going to say that the empirical work I'm familiar with does indicate that ADUs are categorically cheaper than existing residences and comparable residences. There's a study on Babylon, Long Island, which is cited quite a bit, that shows that rents were about 35% lower than comparable listings in the area. There's the Turner Center at Berkeley did a study of Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland. And they looked at public listings and other research, and it showed that there was significant affordability premium, or whatever you want to call it, discount. And if the market isn't going to do it in every situation, there are ways to provide state financing programs to low and moderate income owners that will have some conditions attached. Some of the political opportunity in ADUs is that there isn't a dollar amount attached to an ordinance or a state law. It's just the market can create some of these units, and you're not inflating a state budget. But if the public sector sees the opportunity here and is willing to put some dollars up, you can achieve affordable units at a low cost, owing to the lower cost of construction associated with ADUs. The basement pilot in New York City, for instance, it was going to cost about $1 million, as I recall, and it was going to convert about 40 homes with income restrictions for the tenants. So, I mean, if you know what the cost of affordable housing is, typically that is radically cheap.
Yeah, I'd still say to you, Alec, 35% discount, compared to houses that rent generally in a place like Scarsdale or a place like Westport, frankly, for $10,000 a month, that's still really, really expensive. And, my challenge, and I think Mia has it as well, because I think of Princeton, though it's different, as one of our peer towns, is as people on the ground trying to create more affordable, accessible options for people, how do we do that in different ways? We are working with our Westport Housing Authority. We're working to create an entirely new affordable neighborhood that's designed specifically for families, that's entirely deed restricted, affordable. But, looking at the ADUs, how do we harness the power of having people who in particular towns, high opportunity towns, have the means to create them without government assistance? But how do we harness that to ensure the result is something that is affordable and accessible, so that it's not just a way for people to make a huge amount of money on the side, but a way for people to provide a pathway for someone to live in their town who wouldn't otherwise. And, Mia, I'd love to stay in touch. I want to hear what you find in Princeton over time, but Alec, I'd love you to come. I'll take you around. I'd love to just show you what I'm talking about. It's just, we don't want to do something for the sake of doing it. We want to do it so that it brings us closer to our goal, which is creating this diversity of housing types and options, not just more and more really expensive options for people to potentially live here.
Well,
I'm gonna have to break in, and I apologize because I love this conversation. You guys have made my job super easy. I haven't.
I just want to say one thing, Melissa, to point Danielle, which is that, we have had ADU ordinances on the books in Princeton for 30 years now, and it has been a very affluent town. And the reality is that we have all of these huge houses, and I mean, in part because we're a university town, really the only affordably priced housing for grad students, for visiting professors, for young families, the only thing that of that level that has existed in Princeton are these ADUs. So it did give us some confidence that going forward, making it more widely available, we did have something to base it on. And so anyway, sorry, I just want to say.
No, and I so appreciate this lively discussion. It tells me and Marcel and our other friends at RPA that we need to have more conversations about this topic, but there's a lot to unpack here. So I would like to give the audience just a quick moment we do have a poll question, and just to give some feedback. We had some great questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time for today, but we will keep track of them and circle back. I'll just kind of note the topic areas. One had to do with fair housing regulation and how to address fair housing as part of ADUs, talking about health code, septic, other, kind of regulatory pieces. So we will definitely come back to this conversation. And we just put up, I think there's two polls now. One, partnership has put up a poll just to ask you about your impressions about the conference. And then Nell, I think, who's helping us out in the background here, we'll put up our poll just to get your impressions once we're done with the partnership poll. So we'll just take a few seconds to answer these polling questions. And thank you very much to our panelists today. I really enjoyed listening to what you had to say. I'm thrilled that there's so much interest around this topic. I know Marcel, not to speak for you also, but I know at RPA and Marcel, takes most of the credit for really pulling this all together for us. We had a great team, but Marcel's really been leading the charge on ADUs. So we're excited that there's so much interest in the topic. And
Yeah, I shared the enthusiasm. This was a very lively conversation and so much excitement around ADUs. It's great to see that enthusiasm. But yeah, our poll is out there, so I'm just curious to see the results and how the audience feels about the potential impacts of ADUs.
because I think that's really the question, it's a really good overarching question, is sort of what the impact will be, or what folks, think the impact will be. We're just kind of starting now to get into these regulations and putting them out there, and we'll see, how much housing is really created in the long run with these regulations. So looks like we're done with our poll, and it's pretty split. So do you think ADUs will have a positive impact in terms of increasing housing stock, helping seniors, fixed income households, and addressing the legacy of housing segregation? Is pretty mixed. Huge impact, 40%, modest impact, 40%, significant impact, 20%. So remains to be seen, but we look forward to continuing this conversation. And thank you so much to all of our panelists today, and to the audience, and Marcel, for your opening presentation. And we will talk more as we go forward. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.